Lovely to have you along. Steve Austin's my name. I want to touch base with a story that I've been sort of covering and following for many years, but just want to sort of give another look at it because it involves veterans and their families. You may recall that pre the federal election, the then Labor opposition promised to put some serious funding out there for veterans and families, a sort of a hub, if you like, where a family-friendly space will provide for younger veterans and their families and to bring together the critical services under one roof. This is partly because there's real frustration with the bureaucracy of Canberra, Department of Veterans Affairs, getting what they need, bringing it all together and helping them sort of go to the right place. And there were going to be veterans and families hubs, I think what they were called. And one of them was going to be built in Ipswich. All very good, except it doesn't look like a great deal has happened with them yet. Overall, 10 hubs were announced by the ALP. There were bold announcements for a $5 million Ipswich Veteran Family Hub. So it was announced by the ALP, and there was news stories saying they'd been delivered. But that's not actually the case. So let's go to my guest, Stuart McCarthy. Stuart McCarthy is a retired Australian Army officer. He had a nearly 30-year career. He was deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, Bougainville, Ethiopia, Eritrea and Indonesia. Did I miss anywhere, Stuart McCarthy?
Possibly.
Can't tell me you have to kill me, all that sort of stuff. So what was originally promised?
Well, there was a series of individual announcements about these veterans hubs, in the lead up to the election last year. 10 of them in total. I think the total amount for each one committed was $5 million. And from what I gather during the discussion on Sunday, about 50,000 of that was for whichever organisations who won the tender, for want of a better term, to put together a business case, and then the rest of the $5 million would be split between sort of set up capital type costs,
okay,
and then the remainder would be for a period, the initial period of several years worth of operating costs.
So funding was secured. The government and I think Shane Newman, who's the chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, and also the Labor member for Blair, which takes in the city of Ipswich, he announced that he had secured funding for at least the Ipswich Hub, at least. That's
true. And for a bit more context, Shane was, prior to the election, was the shadow Veterans Affairs Minister.
That's right.
So he was the front man for making this series of announcements during the election last year.
Okay. Have any been built yet?
Now, I had a look. I had a look last night at both the initial announcements and then tried to match them up with the more recent sort of media coverage or ministerial announcements and so on. And what I gathered of the 10, there are two which have been the grants have been approved.
Okay.
And so the lead organisation for that hub has gained that approval, and they're going through that process of business case and then bringing the organisations together and starting work in putting a hub together. There's two, I think, have the government has received expressions of interest to start that process, and the remaining 6, again, from what I can gather, and I'm happy to be corrected, the government is still awaiting expressions of interest from whichever organisations might want to be involved.
So that's sort of RSL or Mates for Mates, or whichever agency
exactly
wants to sort of run them.
or a conglomeration of those. And the Ipswich one, from what I gather from the conversation on Sunday, they fall into that category. So the overall tone of the conversation at the forum, which Shane held on Sunday, was basically, look, here's $5 million on the table. This is broadly what we want to achieve. Please send us an expression of interest so we can start the process.
So on Sunday, there was this open forum or consultation session about setting up the Ipswich Hub. $5 million is there, ready to go. What's being waited on is the RSL or Mates for Mates or some veteran organisation to say, yep, here's our idea, we'll run the program. This is our expression of interest, we'll do it.
Exactly. That's the understanding that I have from.
Okay. And basically everyone now is just waiting.
Yeah, well, I was a little bit bemused because I went along. I mean, kudos to Shane and the minister, Matt Keogh, who was there on a Sunday. It was quite a good forum. There's about 50 odd people there, not only locals, but people from further afield, in southeast Queensland, who came along to discuss broader sort of policy issues with the minister.
So veterans community is really interested in where this is at. They want to see it delivered.
Exactly. But what I was sort of bemused about was that it still hadn't reached the stage where interested organisations had even submitted expressions of interest to, basically what amounts to a $5 million, here's a gimme grant from the government to produce this.
$5 million on the table, does anyone want it?
That's right.
And people are going, oh, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there was some good discussion about what this hub might look like, from the various organisations that were there. Mm-hmm. But, again, as far
Anything you can say what it might look like in Ipswich?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for the various organisations there,
Sure.
but from what I gather in looking at what the government wants to achieve is that we're talking about some kind of basically a physical shop front where people would walk in or call in, walk in, have appointments, and basically this hub would draw together the various, whether it be government services or services and support from, the other ex-service organisations out there, and coordinate, where those people can go to for their needs.
For veterans and their families?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
I believe so.
Now, I spoke to Shane Newman's office today. They said that, they've got to go through the expression of interest process. It should be delivered somewhere between 2024 and 2025. Because DVA, Department of Veterans Affairs, has to go sort of this process, but it will definitely happen, they say.
Well, I mean, hopefully it will happen, but it all rests upon an organisation from that local area who's willing to, submit an expression of interest and actually make it happen.
Are there many veterans and veterans' families sort of on the south of Brisbane, around sort of in Ipswich and out the scrub out that way? From
what I gather, and this came up again on Sunday, based on the census data, Shane was saying that area, that Ipswich area and the electorate of Blair, has one of the highest proportions of veterans and families in the country, which I think is probably fairly accurate.
So that office there, or that shop front, would be a reasonably high priority, you'd think, in the overall scheme of things.
Look, from my perspective, it's not a bad thing and not a bad idea. But the question I have is, surely you would have started with a needs analysis from the beginning. And then, when you look more broadly, given we've got Veterans Royal Commission Royal Commission of Veteran Suicides and that type of thing going on. I mean, I've got some questions about priorities, value for money. There are a lot. So
you're assuming government is logical, rational, and does good needs analysis, Stuart McCarthy?
Well, maybe I'm speaking as somebody who was previously involved in government procurement.
So basically, you want to. So really, the RSL or Mates for Mates or any of the other organisations, need to get a move on. Realise the money's on the table, deliver the expression of interest, and get this thing happening.
That's what I understand. That's how I understand that the process is intended to work.
A side question which you raised, the Royal Commission. My assumption is the Royal Commission will be making a list of recommendations. Because it's been by the sounds of it feels like it's a reasonably comprehensive Royal Commission. I assume that they will be making additional recommendations that will sort of weave into this. Yeah,
this is something, as you know, I've been following very closely for a long time.
I think you've been fighting for this sort of thing for years.
Well, yeah, we have. There's a lot of us have.
Yes.
So where the Royal Commission currently stands is they handed down an interim report several months ago.
Yep.
And that interim report, from memory, included 13 recommendations. The first recommendation was related to what they called harmonising the three different pieces of veterans legislation and all the complexities and so on that go along with that.
Yes.
So that's one thing that I'll give Matt Keogh some credit for. He started on that process, although if we had more time we could, there are definitely some shortcomings in that process as well. So things are happening, yeah.
I know you're plugged in to many aspects of the veterans community here. What are they saying? What's the topic of conversation at the moment amongst your contacts, Stuart McCarthy, in Veterans Affairs and their families?
Well, I guess this issue with the Veterans Hubs is a bit emblematic of where the government stands and where the Department of Veterans Affairs stands, and where there's very much a perception in the veterans community there's a mismatch here. So the government, I think they're well intended. They certainly want to improve services, improve wellbeing, veterans and families, but there's a sense that they're really trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So rather than go out there and hear some of the more marginalised and vulnerable voices, whether that be veterans themselves and their families, and hear about who's falling through the cracks, what urgent support they need, what services are not there, there's this from the government's perspective, there seems to be, let's do the big splash, big announcement, big visible presence, rather than the more difficult but more urgent needs that need to be met.
Forgive me, I want to toss another one at you, completely unscripted. But I've forgotten where things are at, but I asked you about, remember that whole superannuation tax office interpretation?
Oh, yes.
I forgot how to phrase it now, how the correct phrase was, but it was a really big, important battle. Where can you just explain what that was and where is it at?
Yeah,
it's been some years since I've looked at it.
I'll give you the answer first.
Okay.
It's gone nowhere.
It's gone nowhere.
Now, Brad Campbell, who I think you've spoken to previously, he was at the same forum out at Ipswich on Sunday, so he drove down from way up on the north side, about an hour and a half's drive. The same battle is still being fought, but the very short version is that veterans' entitlements to through their own superannuation has been unlawfully taxed
through a particular interpretation method.
Through a particular interpretation,
which veterans were disputing.
It continues to be unlawfully taxed despite a finding of the full bench of the federal court. And broad dollar value, if you go back over the last couple of decades, during a period when this unlawful taxation has been happening, ballpark figure $10 billion has been taken off veterans who've been affected by this unlawful taxation.
Unlawfully taxed, and you had a full bench of the federal court uphold veterans' position.
Exactly.
But the Commonwealth has not changed their interpretation.
No. There have been some moves late, this goes back, well back into the previous government. During the last 12 months or so of the previous government, they started to deal with some of the policy machinations of addressing the legal side of this. And then sort of that, we've had an election since then, and that issue's sort of flowed through to this new government. But no, it hasn't been resolved. There has been some discussion about legislative amendments and that type of thing, but that is still very much a live issue in the veterans community.
Well, we must have a closer look at that in the near future. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
Stuart McCarthy, former member of the Australian Army.